Good afternoon. My name is Erin Payton. I am the Executive Director of the 19th Century Charitable Association, which is located in Oak Park, Illinois. Our mission is strengthening our community through learning, giving, and the sharing of our landmark building. And we're so happy to have you here with us for today's program, which is going to be another great one. Before I start with our next person, I just want to let you know that something in today's program might spark some curiosity in a comment or a question. And if you do want to share your thoughts or pose a question, you can do so in our Q&A or in our chat feature. And if there's time at the end of the program, we will actually go to you and unmute you and ask you to ask your question or share your comment. But for now, sit back and enjoy the program. And I'm going to bring to the screen Diane Moses, who is our program chair.
Hi, and welcome. Kevin Bry is an attorney and professional actor based in Oak Park, Illinois. He has performed in numerous theatrical productions with local theater companies, including the Oak Park Village Players, Oak Park Festival Theater, and Open Door Repertory. Through his production company, Kevin has written, produced, and performed numerous plays, including Our Village, a multimedia docudrama in Oak Park, Illinois, and Trials and Tribulations, a one-man show based on the life and career of attorney Clarence Darrow. And I saw that presentation about Clarence Darrow about 2 or 3 years ago, and I thought, if that guy is a real attorney, I want to hire him. To make a long story short, he is a real attorney, and I hired him. Let's welcome Kevin Bry.
Thank you so much for Diane for that very, very kind introduction. And thanks also, Erin, for being so helpful in preparing me for this presentation. Before I start the presentation on Lincoln proper, I think it's worth mentioning that, as I'm sure you're all aware, today is Martin Luther King Day. It's interesting to me because the same premise that applies to this program about Lincoln, I think, applies to King very well, and that is that their lives were really exceptional and very great subjects for Shakespearean drama. Both King and Lincoln were, in my view, great American heroes. It's been a difficult last few years in a lot of ways, and I wish we had somebody like Martin Luther King Jr. or Abraham Lincoln around. They could have possibly been very helpful through this challenging time. But we are here today to talk primarily about Lincoln. And Abraham Lincoln, of course, has been a great friend of mine, or pardon me, a great hero of mine most of my life. It occurred to me, and I'm not the first, that if William Shakespeare had lived a sufficient amount of time after Abraham Lincoln, would he not have written about Lincoln? Would he not have seen Lincoln's life as a subject of a great tragedy or a great history or both? In fact, not only did Lincoln, his life play out as one perfectly suited to Shakespearean drama, but Lincoln himself had a great appreciation for the bard. Now, we are here today on Zoom. It's a very different experience for me to perform this show on Zoom than the last time I performed it, which was in Illinois' old state capitol's legislative chamber in Springfield. This is where Abraham Lincoln served as a legislator and early in his political career. And it's also where he was laid in state after his assassination. But I think in each place or medium, the purpose is the same, to note the relationship of Lincoln to Shakespeare, or is it Shakespeare to Lincoln, perhaps? And also, while we're here, to consider the 16th president's love of the music of his time. I believe that here now on Zoom, just as they were in Springfield a few years ago, the muses of history, tragedy, and music, and maybe a couple of other of the old gals are here with us. I think the muses will be pleased we celebrate their inspiration. Now, I am certainly far from the first to note the tragic aspects of Lincoln's life. It was felt and observed from the moment a tragic actor's bullet ended Lincoln's life. Walt Whitman wrote far closer to Lincoln's death than now. Why, if the old Greeks had had this man, what trilogies of plays, what epics would have been made out of him? How the rhapsodes would have recited him, how quickly that quaint, tall form would have entered into the region where men vitalize gods and gods divinify men. Whitman said that Lincoln's life played out like some tragic play, vaster and fiercer and more convulsionary for this America of ours than Aeschylus or Shakespeare ever drew for Athens or England. And Whitman also had this interesting observation about Lincoln. He noted it had been said about Shakespeare that his poetic genius was that he, Shakespeare, thoroughly blended the ideal with the practical or realistic. And what Shakespeare did in poetic expression, Lincoln did in both his personal and official life. And the fact that Lincoln was a fan of Shakespeare and the irony that he was murdered by a Shakespearean actor in a theater have long been known and commented on very wonderfully in a book called Assassin on Stage by one Albert Furtwängler. But let's explore a little deeper today. Let's consider the possibilities of what Shakespeare might have written about Lincoln and what we know Lincoln read of Shakespeare. For starters, consider this. If Lincoln had written after Shakespeare, and he'd written, or pardon me, if Shakespeare had written after Lincoln and written about him, wouldn't he have set the first scene of the play at Illinois' old state capitol, where Lincoln said, in a memorable biblical metaphor, a house divided cannot stand? Any tragedian or historical dramatist would do well to start his or play on Lincoln with just that historic speech, which so perfectly sets a backdrop for the coming war to save the Union. Shakespeare, of course, often followed the source material closely, and the House Divided speech would be a must include. You can picture the opening scene of the play, can't you? Either Lincoln delivering the speech or perhaps a couple of minor characters relating the speech and the scene of Lincoln delivering it. Lincoln's tragic life could really not have been scripted better as such. He came from humble origins and rose to power based on qualities of great personal and political excellence. He had some qualities which were seen as flaws at the time, and even from modern perspectives. He was greatly hated by some and resented by many for perceived misuses of his power. And he suffered a violent death at the very point of triumph when there was finally hope for healing. Lincoln's transformation from a cagey but basically regional and initially overwhelmed politician to the brilliant leader of his country in its greatest moment of crisis, with a commitment to preserving the Union and emancipating the slaves and securing their civil rights, could be shown in scene after scene with incidents and events many of us have learned from our youth. There might be tender scenes between Lincoln and his wife or sons. You know, despite considerable comment to the contrary, there was some real tenderness between Abraham and Mary Lincoln. There might be a scene of Lincoln commuting the sentence of a soldier scheduled to be executed for desertion. A scene of Lincoln dealing with his often cantankerous and undermining cabinet, perhaps his informing them that he was going to issue the Emancipation Proclamation whether they liked it or not. A scene of him meeting with the great African American statesman Frederick Douglass, gradually winning the latter's respect and affection. Scenes of Lincoln speaking at Gettysburg and in Washington, D.C. at the inaugural addresses. In the last, the character of John Wilkes Booth will be in the crowd and surely have something to say, as he did near the time, about Lincoln's suggestion that African Americans might become citizens and vote. We can imagine such a play, and oh, what a great play it would have been. Abraham Lincoln began his love of Shakespeare, and in some senses, his artistic life generally, in the village of New Salem, downstate. And by the way, this reconstructed Lincoln era settlement is worth a visit sometime if you haven't done so. Lincoln had little formal schooling, only a year or so growing up. But he benefited as a boy from a caring stepmother, and later in New Salem from the tutoring of the aptly named Mentor Graham, a friend and local schoolmaster. But while Lincoln had little formal schooling, what he did read was some of the best English or any language had to offer: the Bible, Shakespeare, Aesop's fables, poets such as Burns and Longfellow, and several notable philosophers such as John Stuart Mill. According to a biographer, Lincoln in his New Salem days used to pace back and forth in the outdoors in the summer, reciting from Hamlet, Julius Caesar, or other Shakespeare plays. During his life, and by some still, Lincoln was regarded as a simple frontiersman. But in addition to being well-read, he cultivated taste in other arts. It's worth considering his relationship to music as well as to great literature. Not a musical man by training, although there are accounts of his having played some harmonica, he greatly enjoyed the music of the time, including ballads and simple airs, and he listened to music in the White House more than his predecessors had. Now, if you attended a rally during Lincoln's presidential campaign in 1860, you would surely have heard the song Lincoln and Liberty. Let's listen to a portion of it.
Hurrah for the choice of the nation, our chieftain so brave and so true. We'll go for the great Reformation, for Lincoln and liberty too. We'll go for the son of Kentucky, the hero of Hoosiers and through. The pride of the suckers so lucky, for Lincoln and liberty too.
That weekend that I performed this show in the old state capitol's legislative chamber, the Chicago Bar Association Chorus and Orchestra also gave a concert of Lincoln era music, and we sang that song. So it brings back good memories to me. The lyrics of Lincoln and Liberty were adapted to a well-known Irish folk song. In the song, the full song touts abolitionist and log cabin values. A family of singers often appeared at his rallies to perform it and other songs to get the crowd riled up. Now, one of Lincoln's very favorite songs might surprise you. See if you recognize this one.
Well, I wish I was in the land of cotton wool, and there I forgot to look away, look away, look away, Dixieland. In Dixieland where I was born in early on one frosty morning. Look away, look away, look away, Dixieland. Then I wish I was in Dixie, hooray, hooray. In Dixie's land I'll take my stand and live and die in Dixie, away, away.
Lincoln first fell in love with the song Dixie when it was performed in a minstrel show, which Lincoln saw. Of course, he didn't know at the time that it would become the great rallying song of the Confederacy within a few years. In the waning days of the Civil War, he insisted that that song had now become federal property again. Ironically, Dixie was written by a Yankee, a New Yorker. Of course, as with anything connected with the Confederate South, it is controversial to perform the song now. That's kind of a shame because I think it's a really enjoyable tune. But it's not surprising that Lincoln was a music lover. He was a very artistic and sentimental man, as we shall see. Lincoln also loved reading and dabbled in writing poetry. Consider these verses, which are part of a poem that he wrote upon visiting his boyhood home, which he had not been to in many years. He later allowed the poem to be published, so he must have been proud of it. My childhood home I see again, and gladden with the view. And still as memories crowd my brain, there's sadness in it too. O memory, thou midway world twixt earth and paradise, where things decayed and loved ones lost in dreamy shadows rise. Now 20 years have passed away since here I bid farewell to woods and fields and scenes of play and schoolmates loved so well. Where many were, how few remain of old familiar things. But seeing these to mind again, the lost and absent brings. The friends I left that parting day, how changed as time has sped, young childhood grown, strong manhood gray, and half of all are dead. I think that's a pretty good poem myself. That's pretty impressive. I'll bet you Lincoln could have been a poet if he'd spent a lot of time at it. Lincoln's prose writing, often verbalized in his great speeches, was a revolutionary contribution to American literature. His literary influence and excellence is a fit subject for another lecture than this one, and maybe sometime I'll give it. And Lincoln was a great, great fan of the theater. He not only loved Shakespeare's tragedies, but also the comedies and histories. He seemed to prefer to see the comedies live and preferred to read the tragedies and histories. He liked comedies of manners and melodramas of the period, and he went to the theater often, perhaps to get away from the stresses of the presidency and the waging of war. In fact, he had seen his later assassin, John Wilkes Booth, perform in a melodrama at Ford's Theater a couple of years before their fateful encounter in that same theater in April of 1865. Lincoln liked to show off his passion for the theater and for Shakespeare in particular. He often quoted and read scenes from Shakespeare to friends. He was moved to write a letter to a well-known Shakespearean actor named James Henry Hackett, who had given him a book Hackett, had written on the Bard. In that letter, Lincoln critiqued some of Shakespeare's plays and stated, "Some of Shakespeare's plays I have never read, while others I have gone over perhaps as frequently as any unprofessional reader. Among the latter are Lear, Richard III, Henry VIII, Hamlet, and especially Macbeth. I think nothing equals Macbeth. It is wonderful." Let's consider some of the scenes or soliloquies which Lincoln loved in Shakespeare, or which at least fit his various states of mind. It is known that Lincoln throughout his life lost loved ones. He lost his mother when he was a child of just 9 years. He lost his sister in his youth. He lost his father, it seems, before his father died. Lincoln, as an adult, refused to visit his father on his father's deathbed, despite the fact that the dying Thomas Lincoln had asked to see his now prospering son. Lincoln said, "If we could meet now, it is doubtful whether it would not be more painful than pleasant." He lost his apparent first love, Anne Rutledge, when he was a young man. He lost 2 sons during his lifetime. These losses were often followed by long periods of depression, the hypo, as Lincoln called it. And the great burden of the Civil War, of course, weighed upon him, the sometimes poor prospects of victory, the political setbacks, the deaths of hundreds of thousands in the war. Lincoln was often reported as depressed, though not as suicidal. But it is hard to imagine that his thoughts did not at least tend to the subject of suicide at some points. And I ask you, who has written more memorably on the subject of suicide and the hereafter than William Shakespeare? It's known that Lincoln read Hamlet's various soliloquies on death and suicide. He critiqued them to friends and acquaintances. He must have shared Hamlet's thoughts as the Dane considered, "Oh, that this too sullied flesh would melt, thaw, and resolve itself into a dew, or that the everlasting had not fixed his canon 'gainst self-slaughter.' Oh God, God, how weary, stale, flat, and unprofitable seem to me all the uses of this world." He must have debated, like Hamlet did in the soliloquy. To be or not to be, that is the question. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of trouble, and by opposing end them. To die, to sleep, no more. And by a sleep to say we end the heartache and the 1,000 natural shocks that flesh is heir to. 'Tis a consummation devoutly to be wished, to die, to sleep, perchance to dream. Hi, there's the rub. For in that sleep of death, what dreams may come when we have shuffled off this mortal coil must give us pause. There's the respect that makes calamity a so long life. For who would bear the whips and scorns of time, the oppressor's wrong, the proud man's contumely, the pangs of despised love, the law's delay, the insolence of office and the spurns that patient merit to the unworthy takes, when he himself might his quietus make with a bare bodkin. Who would fardels bear to grunt and sweat under a weary life, but that the dread of something after death, the undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveler returns, puzzles the will and makes us rather bear those ills we have than fly to others that we know not of. Thus conscience does make cowards of us all. And thus the native hue of resolution is sicklied o'er with the pale cast of thought in enterprises of great pitch and moment. With this regard, their currents turn awry and lose the name of action. Lincoln's rise to the heights of power was uneven. He turned to politics fairly early in life, and though he lost an initial race for the state legislature, he became a legislator 2 years later and remained one for 6 years. He served a term in Congress in Washington, D.C., but he was denied an expected patronage position in the federal government thereafter. He was spurned initially in his efforts to become a candidate for United States Senator. 2 years later, he lost a race for that office to his political rival, Stephen Douglas's party. The record of their debates has fascinated historians for decades. Lincoln switched political parties mid-career and was only something of a compromise candidate for president. And when he won, he received under 50% of the popular vote. Politics was a rough business for a sensitive person in the 19th century, still is, of course. Now, my research did not confirm whether or not he read Shakespeare's Coriolanus, but I imagine he would have identified with the hurt and anger of the early Roman Republic warrior and nobleman Coriolanus. The title character has been convicted of treason and banished from Rome, and he's had his feelings hurt really badly. He defiantly offers his services to a former enemy. My name is Gaius Marcius, who hath done to thee particularly, and to all the Volscus, great hurt and danger. Thereto witness may my surname, Coriolanus. The painful service, the extreme dangers, the drops of blood shed for my thankless country are requited but with that surname. Only the name remains. The cruelty and envy of the people, permitted by our dastard nobles who have all forsook me, hath devoured the rest and suffered me by the voice of slaves to be whooped out of Rome. Now this extremity hath brought me to thy hearth, not out of hope, mistake me not, to save my life, but in mere spite, to be full quit on those my banishers, stand I before thee here. Then if thou hast the heart of wreak in thee that will revenge thine own particular wrongs and stop those maims of shame seen through thy country, speed thee straight and make my misery serve thy turn. For I will fight against my thankless country with the spleen of all the underfiends. Beautiful language there. Rhymes, vivid imagery, alliteration. I love William Shakespeare. Lincoln's comments and correspondence reveal an apparent identification with unlikely Shakespeare characters, Richard III, Claudius, Macbeth. In the case of Richard III, this is really not so surprising. There were surely winters of discontent in Lincoln's personal and public life, and Lincoln, tall and awkwardly built and ungainly, repeatedly joked about his own physical ugliness. He used to tell a story that went, a man came upon Lincoln, who was splitting rails at the time. The man suddenly took his rifle and trained it directly on the future president. Lincoln demanded to know what he had done to cause offense, and the man answered that he had determined to shoot any man he ever found who was uglier than he, the man, was. Lincoln looked the man over and immediately replied, if I am uglier than you, then blaze away. Beneath such humor was doubtless some pain and insecurity. He certainly may have identified with Richard's description of himself as curtailed of fair proportion and cheated of feature by dissembling nature. During the presidency, Lincoln lost his son Willie and never seemed to fully recover from it. Months later, he read from Shakespeare's King John to a staff officer the following of a parent's hopes and feelings of grief upon the loss of a child. I have heard you say that we shall see and know our friends in heaven. If that be true, I shall see my boy again. Grief fills the absent room. My child lies in his bed, walks up and down with me, puts his pretty looks on, repeats his words. Then I have reason to be fond of grief. Immediately after reading this, he asked the staff officer, did you ever dream of a lost friend and feel you were having a direct communication with that friend and yet a consciousness that it was not a reality? The officer replied he had, that he thought all may have had such an experience. Lincoln confessed, so I dream of my boy, Willie, and began to weep. But it seems to be Macbeth, more than any other play and tragic character, which fascinated Lincoln. This play, more than any other, he read and quoted. Now, if there are reasons for Lincoln's fascination with the character of Macbeth, they're perhaps the Scottish Thane's great ambition and his painful lucidity as to what that ambition had cost him, how he'd lost what he had been and had come to reap what he had sown. Macbeth, for all his monstrous and murderous deeds, is not all villain. He has to be encouraged initially by the suggestions of the three weird sisters and then overtly by his wife to murder his royal predecessor, Duncan. He debates the deed to himself and ultimately acknowledges, I have no spur to prick the sides of my intent, but only vaulting ambition, which o'erleaps itself and falls on the other. Macbeth knows right after his act of regicide that he's done something unnatural, irrevocable. He knows he's doing evil all along. Lincoln, too, was ambitious. He was ambitious from an early age in politics. Those who knew him well knew this. He was jealous of the success of rivals, and he commented to a friend on his fear of doing nothing in life to be remembered by. And Lincoln knew only too well the dualism that defines human beings. He knew that great men were capable of evil, and he knew that base men were capable of heroism. He knew it in himself. He knew it in the men who caused and fought the war for secession. As Mark Twain later pointed out, referring to Lincoln's Kentucky roots, it needed a man of the border to lead the Union during the Civil War, one who knew that brother would fight brother, one who knew all human parties to the quarrel and how human they all were, how much alike they were at bottom, who saw them all reflected in himself. Lincoln knew this dualism in the history of his country, which had left a great evil, slavery, to exist in declaring the country's existence based on principles of liberty and equality. Lincoln, like many of us, must have thrilled to read the impulsion of Macbeth to do violence in Act 2, Scene 1 of Macbeth. Is this a dagger which I see before me, the handle toward my hand? Come, let me clutch thee. I have thee not, and yet I see thee still. Art thou not, fatal vision, sensible to feeling as to sight? Or art thou but a dagger of the mind, false creation proceeding from the heat oppressed brain? I see thee still, in form as palpable as this which now I draw. Thou marshalest me the way that I was going. Such an instrument I was to use. Mine eyes are made the fools of the other senses, or else worth all the rest. I see thee still, and on thy blade and gudgeon, gouts of blood, which was not so before. It is no such thing. It is the bloody business which informs thus to mine eyes. Now o'er the one half world, nature seems dead, and wicked dreams abuse the curtained sleep. Witchcraft celebrates pale Hecate's offerings, and withered murder, alarmed by his sentinel, the wolf, with Tarquin's ravishing strides towards his design moves like a ghost. Thou sure and firm set earth, hear not my steps, which way they walk, for fear the very stones prate of my whereabouts and take the present horror from the time which now suits with it. Whilst I threat, he lives. Words to the heat of deeds too cold breath gives. I go, and it is done. The bell invites me. Hear it not, Duncan, for it is a knell that summons thee to heaven or to hell. Lincoln must also have thrilled, being such a great user of metaphor and such a lover of the theater, to Macbeth's resigned pronouncement upon being informed of Lady Macbeth's death. Tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace from day to day to the last syllable of recorded time. And all our yesterdays have lighted fools the way to dusty death. Out, out, brief candle. Life's but a walking shadow, a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage, and then is heard no more. It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. Now, there is, of course, another Shakespeare play, considered by most a tragedy, although by some a problem play, which greatly bears upon Lincoln, and that is Julius Caesar. Here, the stream of John Wilkes Booth and family, which I mentioned before, becomes a major tributary which flows into the great and mighty river that is Abraham Lincoln. As I mentioned earlier, Lincoln had seen Booth, and also his brother Edwin, by the way, perform several times before. To appreciate the tragic fate that brought Lincoln and John Wilkes Booth together, we have to consider the nature and the origin of the Booths. John Wilkes Booth's father, Junius Brutus Booth, was one of the foremost actors of his generation. He was an Englishman by birth, and he gained renown in that country, then came to this country in 1821, and he acted here to great acclaim for 3 decades before dying in 1852. The family settled in Maryland, a very torn state leading to the Civil War, one that had slavery but remained in the Union fold. Apparently, the father was something of a hothead and an alcoholic, and is said himself to have threatened to kill a president, Andrew Jackson. Both of John Wilkes's older brothers, Junius Jr. and Edwin, were highly successful actors, the former primarily out west and Edwin in the north and east. The youngest brother was wild-brained, according to his brother Edwin, but a promising actor and a very handsome young man. His wild, many later said his mentally ill nature, began to assert itself more and more during the Civil War. According to Edwin, his brother was obsessed with the secession of the southern states. That he was insane on that particular point, Edwin later remembered, no one who knew him well can doubt. And John Wilkes, his family remembered, was terrified that Lincoln would become king. This was the same worry that led the conspirator Marcus Brutus to assassinate Caesar in Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. Before he went off the deep end, John Wilkes Booth joined his brothers Junius and Edwin in a benefit performance of Julius Caesar in Central Park in New York in the autumn of 1864. The occasion was to raise money for a statue of none other than, guess who? William Shakespeare. That night, John Wilkes played the part of Mark Antony. Now, this, of course, is somewhat ironic. Antony, as some of you know, was loyal to Caesar, the assassinated leader in that fascinating play. Wilkes Booth, of course, later identified with the character of Brutus, a Roman noble and a leader of the assassins of Caesar. But while Antony was loyal to the leader of his country, and John Wilkes Booth was anything but, the character Antony and the brother who portrayed him in Central Park shared some similar traits, including a capacity to act out of motives of revenge and in such a way as would cause chaos and destruction to the country they professed to love. For instance, Wilkes Booth would have recited the following speech of Antony's. Woe to the hand that shed this costly blood. Over thy wounds now do I prophesy. A curse shall light upon the limbs of men. Domestic fury and fierce civil strife shall cumber all the parts of Italy. Blood and destruction shall be so in use, and dreadful objects so familiar, that mothers shall but smile when they see their infants quartered with the hands of war. All pity choked with custom of fell deeds, and Caesar's spirit, ranging for revenge, with Ate by his side come hot from hell, shall in these confines, with a monarch's voice, cry havoc, and let slip the dogs of war. That this foul deed shall smell above the earth with carrion men groaning for burial. Now, there are some obvious comparisons between Lincoln and Caesar. Both were truly great figures who revolutionized the society and politics of their time. Both were loved by many, but also hated by many, and felt to have used their positions in tyrannical ways. Both were and had good cause to be aware of the danger that they would be assassinated. The historical record reveals numerous instances where Lincoln seemed to foresee his death by assassination. Consider this chilling incident, which Lincoln himself later described. Shortly after his election to the presidency, on multiple occasions, he saw himself in a mirror, and to his great concern, saw two separate and distinct images. Quote, the tip of the nose of one being about 3 inches from the tip of the other, end quote. One of the faces was, quote, a little paler, say 5 shades than the other, end quote again. Lincoln referred to the second face as a ghost, and his wife Mary believed this was a sign that he would be elected to a second term, but would not see his life through the second term. Lincoln was, in fact, shot at during his first term in office, and he acknowledged the ever-present possibility he could be assassinated. In a country like this, he said, where our habits are simple and must be, assassination is always possible and will come if they are determined upon it. Particularly as he approached the end of his days, he apparently dreamed such scenes as a ship approaching the shore, or people visiting the White House for an unspecified funeral. Lincoln's fascination with Macbeth and seeming fascination with his mortality continued until almost the hour of his death. Just a week before John Wilkes Booth murdered him, Lincoln read from the Scottish play to aides and friends, quoting Macbeth, speaking of the assassination of King Duncan. After life's fitful fever, he sleeps well. Treason has done his worst. Nor steel, nor poison, malice domestic, foreign levy, nothing can touch him further. Treason did its worst to Lincoln on April 14th, 1865, which was Good Friday. John Wilkes Booth had recently changed a plan with conspirators from merely kidnapping Lincoln to murdering him. He may have felt, as Brutus did in Julius Caesar, that between the acting of a dreadful thing In the first motion, all the interim is like a phantasm, a hideous dream. Lincoln, his wife, and another couple sat watching a play, a comedy called Our American Cousin. Mary Lincoln had been leaning on the president's lap and asked him playfully, "What will Miss Harris, who shared the box with them, think about her leaning on him?" Lincoln replied, "She won't think anything about it." John Wilkes Booth entered the box, immediately stepped forward and shot the president in the back of the head at close range. As the president slumped over, mortally wounded, Booth immediately leapt to the stage and dramatically shouted, "Sic semper tyrannis," meaning thus ever to tyrants. Lincoln, after languishing through the night in a house across from the theater, died the next day. Booth went on the run, writing in his notebook that he'd acted on the Ides and referring to himself as even purer in motive than Brutus. Within 2 weeks, he was tracked down and himself shot and killed. Now, not only is it ironic that Booth had portrayed Antony, but yet viewed himself as a modern day Brutus, the honorable, perhaps to a fault, tragic hero of Julius Caesar. It's ironic because Booth, unlike Brutus, was not considered personally honorable by many people, but like Brutus, his assassination did not cause the consequences that he intended. Just as Caesar's assassination led not to a new beginning for the Republic, but rather to the epic of Caesarism, Lincoln's assassination led not to a popular insurrection and a change in policies, but rather to the fitful grant of political freedom to African Americans and to the secular sainthood of the president. John Wilkes Booth, in his fevered political state of mind, came to confuse art with life. And when you think about it, Booth's bad face was really a two-headed evil. For isn't it truly awful that an actor should kill an enthusiastic patron of the theater when actors are so dependent upon and indebted to their audience, the audience which supplies the actors their very purpose? And isn't it the worst of faith for a citizen to kill its elected leader in a constitutional democracy when the elected leader has office by the will of the people? And by the way, what a credit to Edwin Booth that despite such a familial and national tragedy, he continued acting, becoming his generation's greatest tragic actor, successfully portraying Hamlet and other Shakespearean tragic heroes for many years to come. The great tragic story that is the life of Abraham Lincoln has lines that go in countless different directions, from ancient Greece to Elizabethan England, the whole breadth of this country before, during, and after the Civil War. It's a tragedy, the life of Lincoln, to be sure, but it's an uplifting one, which could inspire not only a great tragic or historical play, but perhaps a great opera or a musical as well. For Shakespeare in writing his great plays for the stage, for Lincoln in reading Shakespeare and attending plays, for any musicians in the audience among us, art gives us sustenance in both the winters of our discontent and the glorious summers of our life. We must imagine the muses greatly pleased in Lincoln and in Shakespeare, and I imagine that they're happy that we were able to get together today here on Zoom. Thank you so much. Thank you.
And thank you for a wonderful presentation. How very, very interesting. I have one question to ask you. From your many performances and things that you've written and produced, what do you enjoy doing the most?
What a great question. Great question. I think anyone who performs a lot and in a wide variety of stuff, has a very hard time answering that question. I know that when I started out as a young guy, I was performing probably for the ego of it, to be noticed. I think as I've matured, become older, it's become more about the relationships and the community and the teamwork involved. So I'm saying that's what I like about it, whether it's a full-scale play with a larger cast or whether it's a one-man production. I really like working with other people and hopefully connecting with other people. That's it.
Okay, thank you again. It was really, really interesting and terrific. And I think other people might have some questions.
All right, that was really great. So glad we got to hear from you and Lincoln and Shakespeare and all sorts of other characters from our history. Let's see, I'm checking to see, we've got some comments. A lot of people are saying, great job, Kevin. And how interesting and informative it was, well researched. Well, I'm just trying to see. Oh, here we go. Here are some questions. Okay, so here's a great question from Jean Louise.
Hi. First of all, Kevin, I met you years ago through Ed Wilson. We did a showcase together.
Oh, that's right. Yes, yes. Very good. Now I'm remembering. I was trying to put two and two together.
With your daughter too, was in it.
Yes.
So anyhow, my question is, I noticed before you did the various monologues that you kind of went in yourself. I was wondering, what you say to yourself before you perform the different monologues that you did today?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And I think different actors perhaps approach that differently. I know that sometimes while I'm working on the monologues, I'll try to make it personal to me. If my character is speaking of a lost love that they had in their youth, I might try to think of if I had had one while I'm trying to be the character and saying the character's line. I'm also trying to relate it to how I have felt or feel. And I think if you do that a little bit and you do get comfortable with the lines, then it all kind of takes care of itself, and you're more thinking as the character in the moment. You know, trying to work on memories and associations as you say the lines. So yeah, it's rich. It's one of the things I love about doing monologues and acting is that you get to go on those journeys both as an actor and also then as a character.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thanks, Jean Louise. And now Andrew Scott has a question. Andrew, if you want to unmute.
So I remember Steve Martin had written a play about an imaginary meeting between Picasso and Einstein. And just as you were performing, I was thinking of your next script that you write would be an imaginary meeting between Shakespeare and Lincoln. So
yeah, thanks. That would be something. That would be something. Yeah, for sure.
Awesome.
All right.
Thank you, Andrew.
You could throw Hemingway in there too for good measure. The three of them.
Yeah, why not? Why not?
Thank you. Here is a great question from Dale. Dale, you want to unmute yourself? Hi.
Hello. Hello.
Hi.
Hello. Hello, Dale.
I'll give you notes later, Kevin.
Yes.
Great.
But my question is how was this Zoom experience different from performing it on the stage for you today? What was that like that you went through?
Mm-hmm. Great question, Dale. Thank you.
that is a great question. And Dale, who by the way is an Oak Parker and a mentor of mine, a wonderful theatrical professional, Dale Calandra. Thank you. This is the first actual performance I've done on Zoom, Dale. I've certainly been on Zoom in meetings, but so it's kind of hard, I think, to get there. You've got to work hard to get there on your own because you don't have the feedback of the audience, person to person. And this being the kind of show where, of course, you're breaking the fourth wall for most of it, and talking directly to the audience in the lecture portions. So you don't get that feedback that you get sometimes through looking people eye to eye in the audience if you can. But I will say, as it goes on, that starts to take care of itself. I noticed. I started feeling more in contact with people, even though I could not see them. So it grows on you. And I guess maybe that's the muses at work, perhaps.
It certainly gets easier as the performance goes. I'll tell you that much.
Yes.
You start to trust your own voice and what you're putting out there.
Thanks,
All
Dale.
right. William Slayton has a question. William, if you just unmute yourself.
Hi, Kevin.
Hey, Bill.
Hey, that was fantastic.
Thanks.
So what was it like to perform that in Springfield?
Oh, it was awesome. I gotta say, it was so awesome. I don't know how many here in this audience have been to a Springfield trip is a really great idea if you haven't done it. Go see Lincoln's home, go to the Lincoln Museum, of course, post-COVID.
Right.
But the old state capitol is this wonderful building, and the legislative chamber is so beautiful and so classic. And I will tell you, I had the most moving experience the next day because I performed in the legislative chamber. Lincoln's been there. He worked there. He was laid in state there. When I went to the Lincoln Museum the next day, they had a large exhibit that was the same legislative chamber decked out with Lincoln in state. Now it was 50% of the size, but it was still the same room. And I walked in there unawares, and it was one of the most emotional experiences of my life. It was like walking into Lincoln's funeral, and of course I was connected with Lincoln quite a bit from preparing the show and performing it. So, but the whole experience was great. It's a wonderful place to perform, and anybody who hasn't had one or hasn't had one since you were a kid, I really highly recommend a Lincoln vacation. Go down for 2 or 3 days and see everything if you can.
That's what I was going to say. It's a different experience going as a kid, and then also going as an adult, and then also taking kids, because I know that's on our agenda in the next 2 years whenever we're able to do that, because you see it differently depending on what stage of your life you're in.
Sure.
So it's definitely a great place. All right, Gil, we're gonna gingerly let you ask this question. If you want to unmute yourself. Hi.
Gingerly, hi. Just extending it to the modern day. If Shakespeare were to write a play about Trump, would you think it would be a tragedy or a comedy or simply a history?
Yeah, Shakespeare was so wonderfully thoughtful and reflective. I don't think he could really treat that as a comedy. The Trump experience has been, I think, a serious one on levels that Shakespeare would understand and intuit. And I think it would be more of a historical play, a history, and hopefully no more of a tragedy than it has appeared to be in recent weeks. So yeah, I think it would be a serious play, and I think it would be a history.
Gingerly asked, gingerly answered. Thank you, both of you. Marky, did you want to ask your question? You want to mute yourself?
I was just interested in knowing, number one, I really enjoyed it. And you could certainly see that Lincoln was really depressed with the type of literature he was into.
Yes.
But was there other literature that was important to him at this time?
You know, I'll be honest. I don't know. I don't. I'm sure there was, and I'm sure some of the poetry that he read, he would have continued to read during the Civil War. So I really was focusing so much on the drama that I kind of didn't make as good mental notes of the rest as perhaps I could have to answer the question. But I'm quite sure that there was other philosophy that he might have read. You know, to write those wonderful speeches, such as the second inaugural address or the Gettysburg Address. You've got to be filling your life with some meaningful literature. So I'm sure that he did other than Shakespeare in the poetry or the political stuff.
Mm-hmm. And it's so interesting to think too how, you know, now when the president gives a speech, how many hands touch that speech before he gives it. And you think about someone like Abraham Lincoln, and probably, you know, his mark on it was probably way more than what it is now, where it has to pass so many different levels of approval typically before a speech gets handed out. But I'm sure back then it was way more his, and he owned it.
Yes, yes, yes.
Which is just, again, you know, he wasn't paying a speechwriter full time. That, you know, those were his words, so much of that. So his poetry really did come out so beautifully. I am looking, and I'm looking for any more. I mean, we're getting lots of virtual applause and kudos and bravos for you. But I feel like we've answered the majority of the questions, which were all very good. You guys are paying attention at home. Thank you so much. Kevin, before we let you go, do you have any last comments or anything you want to leave us with for Shakespeare, for Lincoln, or for anything else? Doesn't have to be extremely profound.
It's not profound, and it's not for Shakespeare or Lincoln. It's just for me. Thank you so much to make this possible during this, again, challenging time. And what a wonderful treat to me to not only share something, but I've got some very wonderful close friends in the audience. And I'm just so thankful that you do this, the 19th Century Club, and for everybody who took time out of their day to join means a great deal to me personally. So thank you all.
Yeah, and I want to second that. I think Kevin is really speaking from the heart there. I think in general, when someone comes to see your show, you know, they have to get in their car and they have to drive and buy a ticket and see and stuff. But this is just as meaningful when you support someone doing something, even if it's just clicking on Zoom. It means so much to performers to know that you're out there and paying attention and supporting them. So on behalf of Kevin and all the performers out there, I double down on that. Thank you, because it really does mean the world to support live theater, even if it's live via your computer. So speaking of more shows and programs to your computer. We do have programs every single Monday afternoon at 1:30. And if you want to see what we're doing next up or in the next couple of weeks, just go ahead and look at our website at www.19thcentury.org. If you want to help us continue to put on these amazing programs, consider a donation. You can also do that right on our homepage at www.19thcentury.org. And if you have any questions, you can always email me and I will answer them readily. Well, for Kevin and Diane and everyone at the 19th Century Charitable Association, thank you once again for attending this program. We appreciate it and appreciate you, and we'll see you at the next one. Have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.